Welcome to the Classroom Café, where it's all about brewing the conversation between fellow educators. This special presentation is brought to you by the United Federation of Teachers and the union's Member Assistance Program. Thank you for joining us today. We hope this podcast inspires you, nourishes you, and motivates you. Now let's get started. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Classroom Café podcast. I'm Selma Williams, Mental Health Manager here with the UFT's Member Assistance Program, and we are joined also by our co-host, Janisa Costa.
I'm Janisa Costa, Clinical Coordinator and Substance Use Associate at the UFT's Member Assistance Program.
Yes, our topic of discussion today is geared towards creating equity in our classrooms. We're joined today by Moza Coote, a DOE classroom teacher for 13 years, and now Teacher Development Specialist with the Office of Teacher Development. Moza, thank you for joining us.
It is a pleasure. It's an honor to be with you both here and your listeners. Just thank you for having me today.
Of course. So this topic today, I think, is needed as we're airing at the beginning of a new school year. I think it's safe to start with defining what equity is. Can you just help us with that, Moza?
I feel like equity is, it's a buzzword right now. It's a word everyone has on their lips, everyone has included in their, mission, vision. But as frequently used as it is, everybody doesn't quite mean the same thing. I think we have our own definitions floating. And I just wanted to share a definition that I think really gets to the heart. So equity is first about understanding the needs that are in the classroom that you teach, the needs that the students you serve have. And then the work of equity is doing what's needed to meet those needs. So equity is a two-part thing, understanding the needs and then doing the work to meet those needs. A lot of times people confuse equity and equality, and those are not the same thing. Equality says everyone is going to get the exact same thing. And what's problematic about that is I'm getting the same thing as everyone else. It doesn't mean that what I've got meets what I need.
Yeah, or what I'm getting meets what I need.
Exactly. So the work of equity teachers, teachers first have to see that it's not equitable in their classroom, because you can't start work you don't see a need to start, right? You have to first name that there is an inequitable or many inequitable situations or circumstances or experiences happening in the classroom where you teach. And then you have to ask yourself, what is needed to make sure that I meet these needs that I'm seeing.
So how do we do that? That sounds like a big task or a big ask. I imagine it can also feel a little daunting, right? If you're thinking about a teacher, an educator who has a classroom of 30 or unfortunately sometimes more students, right? How does an educator identify and understand the needs of each of those 30 plus students?
For me, I want to first acknowledge that, equity is not it's not something you can have a checklist for. Equity is, or working towards equity, it's a process. And I think before teachers say, I'm going to make an equitable classroom and I'll do this and I'll do this, we don't want to oversimplify how we are working towards equity. First, it's going to require self-work. Before a teacher looks outward, they really have to do some reflection. And I know when we talk to teachers about reflection, typically we're talking about, oh, reflect on your lesson, reflect on the plan, reflect on the day. But this reflection is deeper than that. This reflection is one that you have to do on yourself. Like,
Mhm.
you've got to begin with some self work. And I'll give you, this idea of how what's happening externally can make you realize I have some work to do. So,
Mhm.
a lot of times, teachers look at behavior that's happening in the classroom and say, oh, Johnny's misbehaving. Oh, there's always like an externalization of what's happening in the classroom. So sometimes things that are happening in your classroom communicate that the conditions in your classroom are not equitable.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
I say this just because a lot of times when things are happening with students, it could well be that something is happening with the student, but a lot of times we fail to reflect on how what's happening with the student is really communicating to us about the atmosphere or the environment that's in the classroom. I'll give you an example. A
Mm.
student is disruptive, a student is misbehaving in a class. And are there circumstances when students' misbehavior is indicative of something happening with the student? Absolutely. But I think as the leader of the classroom, a teacher has to assess what's my place in what's happening.
Mm.
Misbehavior is communication. And it could be communication about, the realities the student is walking through, but it could also be about the space the student is having to learn in. And so the
Mm.
reflection I'm asking or hoping that educators will engage in is not only on what I think and what I thought about the lesson, but I feel like the most powerful practice shifting reflection happens in collaboration with the students. We are serving the students. How often do we ask students about the atmosphere they're learning in, about the learning
Mm.
experiences that they're having?
Mhm.
How often have we co created that learning space that students are experiencing? So I can speak from my own practice that when I have had experiences where students were disruptive, and indeed it was really something happening with those babies. They were walking through situations that they brought into the classroom. But there were
Mhm.
absolutely times when that behavior was a response to conditions that were also present in my classroom.
Wow.
And I think
Mhm.
that's what I mean about the self work. Are you willing to name that you might be contributing to an inequitable situation?
Mm.
Are you willing to look with your students, invite them to co reflect with you and talk about this space that you occupy for how many periods or minutes or hours every day? And equity is not something that we can sort of visit. When we are the kind of equity we're talking about is once you understand the needs in the classroom, that you're working to meet those needs so that students can thrive and be successful every day. And that every day, that's why I'm saying it's a big ask, right?
Mhm.
It can't say, oh, they were successful because at the end of the year they passed the test. Like,
Mm.
that's not the measure of equity. Equity
Mhm.
is a daily checking in, because maybe I had a classroom that was equitable yesterday and something happened that made it not as equitable as it was yesterday. So I'm saying it's a process, and it's reflective, and it's messy, and it's not easy, but it should not be something we shun or fail to embrace. We should be
Mm.
willing to take, even if it's baby steps. Like, we need to get into a place of humility. And I don't know that that's something teachers are necessarily
Mm.
invited to come to this work with. Like, teachers, a,
Yeah.
a lot of us have come to it like, you're the expert, you know all about science, and you're going to teach these children about
Mhm.
science. Like, but when do we get to a place where we realize that learning and education is not just about depositing subject content into children's head. Learning is a social, it's an emotional process. It's intellectual, but we bring our whole humanity to this to this experience of learning. And
Yeah.
Mhm.
why are teachers not examining how, I mean, there are terms out there like spirit murder.
Oh,
Yeah, that's a term.
sense.
Yeah.
Spirit murder is a term that's basically used to describe experiences where parts of children are dying in our classrooms.
Wow.
Very classrooms that fail to recognize the entirety of the humanity these babies bring every day. I can be given math problems, but something this teacher said killed a whole
Mm,
part of my culture that I'm proud about.
mhm,
I'll
Mm.
give you one example. There was a student was talking about how a teacher came, brilliant teacher, and clearly knew subject, heard great things about the content. But the very first day the teacher walks into the classroom, the teacher says, "Oh, all of you look the same. I'll tell you right now, I won't remember any of your names."
wow.
I can relate to an experience like that, and it shifts the entire attitude that a student's walking into a classroom with.
Absolutely. I love what you're saying, doing that self-work, right?
Mhm.
As an educator in the classroom, because now's the time everybody's prepping to reopen their classrooms, right? And it's very academically focused. So, what are some things that educators can do to begin that prep work to create equitable classrooms?
Because it is self work, it will be different work for each person, right?
Mhm,
I think self work begins with some really honest conversations. And sometimes, like I was sharing, that reflection and that increased self awareness and reflection, it can't happen. It's just not going to happen automatically.
yeah, yeah,
Sometimes you need to read something, you need to listen to something, you need to talk to someone else to support your eye opening in something that maybe you were just not aware about. And I'll say this, like, so there are teachers who would say, uh, equity, of course my classroom is equitable. And then the question you have to ask yourself is, how do you know? Like,
mm.
what's the
Oh,
evidence you have?
How do you measure it? Right.
Yes. And
yeah.
if the measurement doesn't come from the people who are experiencing your
Mhm.
classroom, that's like, the cook in the kitchen saying, "Oh, this dish is perfect,"
The best
without,
I've ever had.
yes, without regard to what customers are telling you. Like,
Mhm.
wow, what in the world was this dish? Like, are we willing to listen
Mm.
to
Yeah,
those
yeah.
voices? And these voices may be 3 years old, they may be, 5 years old, they may be 17 years old. You may have the 21-year-old students, but there really are like opportunities. I mean, I think as you go in, you can start by reading. There's so many resources out there. And I would
Mm,
say there's work. Many people know Elena Aguilar. She does a lot of coaching work, and she has, if you go to her website, Bright Morning,
mhm,
and you type in Bright Morning Alina Aguilar, she has so many resources around equity and really having these like like reading materials that can spark our understanding about the realities of inequity in New York City public schools. Like, let's just start with the fact that so the UCLA Civil Rights Project, a number of years ago, found that New York City public schools are the most racially segregated schools in the
mhm.
country.
In the country. Wow.
Wow.
In the country. And you simply, you can just Google that UCLA Civil Rights
Mhm.
Project, or you can Google
Yeah.
New York City Public Schools segregation.
Yes, linked to the zoning, right? Janice and I were talking about that the other day.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think about those educators who are in classrooms or, leading classrooms of children that don't particularly look like them, right? How do
Yes.
you manage that and negotiate through those and navigate, not negotiate, navigate through that type of situation? Should an outside, in order to manage, to create equity, right? Do What would be a best practice in that instance? Would we bring in another teacher to kind of bounce ideas off of that might have experience in the area or might know the backgrounds of the students that we're engaging?
Yes, I love that. Um that's absolutely a great idea, to honor the experiences of educators around you. And like I say, um I think, you see, when you are not the same cultural, racial, religious background of the students before you, I spoke about humility,
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
and you have to have the humility to ask yourself, what learning do I have to do?
Mm.
And the learning is not like, oh, I read a book over the summer, so, I'm good now. But like I
Yeah.
said, it's a process. Do we have the humility to put ourselves in a um learning space? And again, like I say, these things are not always the easiest to digest because they don't allow us to be comfortable. um
Mhm.
we have to have the humility to say, these children that I'm serving, I don't know much about their experiences. I don't know much about their culture, what they're facing, what they know.
Mhm.
And if I don't know it, how can I support it? How can I honor it in this
Mhm.
classroom?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You know?
And create equity.
Correct,
Yep.
correct. Because if I don't know what my students' experiences are, I don't know what my students need, and then I cannot create the equitable classroom that really is working to meet those needs.
Or validate the fact that you don't know how, right? Because sometimes, I think a lot of it is thinking that you have to have the answer. But I think children are students, because they're not all young children, but students are. I think they're able to understand, or it would create a more empathetic classroom if they heard more adults and the educators in their life say that they don't know the answers, right? And pretend to have it all together. I think is another component, right, of that self work and being vulnerable in front of your classroom is a part of that.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
I think what you're saying is this idea of, we are asking children to be open. We're asking students to
Mhm.
share their experiences, their identities, their needs, but are we modeling that?
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Correct.
And that goes back to the vulnerability and the humility. Like, I will model. I remember having a conversation with a teacher, such a brilliant teacher, when I was in the classroom, and she talked about how she modeled making an error in math. Like, she was doing she was doing something, and she normalized making mistakes. She
Mhm.
normalized not being perfect, and she said she found it just unlocked a sort of freedom in the class for kids who normally would not speak because they're not sure they have the perfect answer. She said it
Yeah.
just helped everyone realize we're human, and that's what we're doing in this classroom, learning and trying. And it's okay. Mistakes are part of the
The
learning process
journey.
and the
Yeah.
journey. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. And if we're talking about racial equity, we're talking about educational justice for every child. How are we modeling, like you beautifully said, that we don't know, that we've got a lot of learning to do, that our children can teach us, or our students can teach us so much of the things we are wanting to understand and know about what they need? I just wanted to share one thing about, inequity. And I think a lot of times people feel like, ooh, inequity, ooh, that's something people do on purpose. Like, I think a lot of people default to saying, no, no, my classroom is totally equitable because they haven't, like, they're not intentionally or they in their mind they're not intentionally
Mm-hmm.
preferring one group or you know putting down another group. But this is the thing about inequity. It's systemic, and no one has to be here saying, well, today I will oppress and I will be abused.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's not how this works. The reason
Mhm.
this inequity exists even after laws have been passed for, when we talk about Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka,
Mm-hmm.
Kansas. Like, we thought the law was passed and
Mm-hmm.
it
And that was
and
it.
that was it. But these things have survived the passage of this law because it's in our socialization. It's in the air
Yeah.
we breathe. And whether we are white people or we are teachers of color, believe it or not, racism is internalized for those of us who are people of color. And we, even as people of color, can perpetuate inequitable outcomes for the very students that look like
Mm-hmm.
us too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
So I'm saying to you that I think unintentional is not, doesn't mean that it's not happening in your classroom. Unintentional just makes it even more critical that you are asking other people to offer their perspectives, because that means you have a blind spot. Are you willing to let someone else help you see where you may have missed it? Are you willing to let the students share with you? And you can even do this anonymously. There used to be an activity I used to do. Now, again, you've got to have the readiness to stomach some of the responses you're going to get, because
Yeah.
it might hurt you. It might break your heart to know what students are experiencing. But again, that's the self work, the willingness to embrace that I'm on a journey and I've got work that I'm going to always have to be doing. So the
Mhm.
activity it was called Things I Wish Miss Coote Knew.
Mm-hmm.
And there were several prompts I offered, things you want me to know about you, things that you want me to know about how your experience in this class has been going, things you want me to know about anything. And I said, even if the prompt isn't here, please, I just want to know what it's like, whether it's being a student in my classroom, whether it's just being you as a human being. And when I tell you, I got such a range of response. It was anonymous, was pretty early in the school year. And oh my goodness, I mean, I, I don't think I was prepared for the range of responses I got. I got everything from, oh, I love eating, vanilla ice cream. I got everything from I have sisters to abusive situations that were happening, to
Mhm.
books the kids didn't like, to things that had happened in the classroom that they thought I was unfair. I
Mm-hmm.
seemed to already kind of show favoritism, or I tried to raise my hand, you didn't. There were all these things, and it was a lot. And I definitely didn't have the tools and the learning that I have now. And even now, I just want to say I'm not here on this podcast as an expert by any means. I have a lot of learning to do, and I want to learn. I'm not an expert. I'm just sharing my journey where I am right now. But definitely then equity was not even a word I was using in my repertoire. But I knew things weren't sitting well with all the babies, and I had to think about, whoa, now that I know, well,
Mm-hmm.
what am I going to do?
Mm-hmm.
Some things I had to go to the school counselor with, because I didn't know. Kids who said they were being abused, I didn't know how to deal with that. But the things that were happening in my classroom about kids feeling dismissed, kids
Yeah.
feeling like I wasn't paying attention to them, those were opportunities for me to grow, for me to acknowledge that there were failures in my practice as a teacher, and I had to
Mm-hmm.
decide, do I want to grow, or do I want to continue to create this kind of environment in my classroom?
Wow.
Yeah.
I think about how much of a safe space that can create for students, who might not have another outlet or another adult who actually is interested in things that they're interested in, wants to know what's bugging them, you know? And I think about what you said earlier about spirit murder, right? And how a lot of times you remember that one teacher or the two teachers that have committed acts towards that could be considered spirit murder, right? So if I'm an educator who has possibly done something, and I think everybody in their lifetime has experienced, saying something that they shouldn't have or acted in a way that they shouldn't have. How do we come back? How do we begin to build that bridge again with the student, or maybe, with that next batch of students, if the next school year of students, if that student has passed through our class already? How do we begin to make amends?
I think it's the beautiful thing is first recognizing that I do have to make amends. If the child is still in my school, can I find this child and just say, I want to name that I hurt you. I didn't treat you right. We have to get to a place of humility. The child is not in ours. Like, I think having conversations where we are vulnerable and where we can name that, look, I messed up. This wasn't something that I really realized in the moment, but now that I do, I just want to name that I wronged you. And I think I think a lot of kids are taken aback when an adult can apologize. And I
Oh, yeah.
think when things happen, like if things happen in our classroom, are we going to have the courage and again the humility to stop? If we said something in front of a class that was wounding to a child, and we come to this realization overnight, and now we have the child before us in the next period or whatever, can we up it happened publicly, can we model apologizing publicly? Because I think sometimes we want the cover of privacy, right? But when a microaggression or just an out and out, you know, aggression or wrong happened, I think students, like teachers might feel this takes their power away, but I think it shifts the kind of classroom you've created. You've modeled something for these children. Like, you've modeled humility, you've modeled the ability to apologize, you've said you want to work on it, and guess what that does? It builds in accountability, whether you realize it or not. Those children take note, and you can invite them into the process. Like, students, I said something yesterday that I was reflecting on, and I want to, student, and you name the student. I want, maybe you start with the private conversation with them first, and you can invite them with, like, is it okay if I just make this apology before the class? Because I want to make it right. Kids who heard it, even if it wasn't directed to them, they were impacted by what you said. It sent a message to them. It landed on them somehow. As uncomfortable as it might be for the teacher to have to sort of acknowledge, I wronged the student. How do I make it right? Do the private work, do the one-on-one, but then go back and put it out there to the class. Ask the class, tell the class, I'm on a journey. I want to do better. It could have been anything, an inappropriate joke, a joke that mocked someone's identity, a joke that, put down somebody's culture. We've got to name that we're in a process. And I think once you couch it as, students, I didn't do right. I'm asking you to be on this journey with me. Hold me accountable. Let's create this community where we are respectful and honoring of each other. And if we do these things, and I don't want to use this term, calling people out. Like, that's not what we want to do. There's
Right.
another phrase, people call it calling people in. Call me back into the community of us wanting to honor each other. Call me back to the commitment that I say I've made. Call me back to this, place of being a model and an example of the thing that I'm hoping we can share together as a class.
Yeah. And I love that you said calling people in instead of calling them out. And I feel like, especially amongst our students and youth, right? And just in our culture and society in general, there's this, you hear about cancel culture. And everyone's getting canceled, but it's so problematic because you miss that opportunity to call someone in.
Yeah.
You
Yes.
miss that opportunity to give that person the space to hold themselves accountable and to apologize and to do the work, right?
Yes.
To do that work. And so I love this idea of calling the person in.
Yes.
Um,
And I want to just add the idea of grace. When
mhm.
we do have cancel culture, you said so beautifully, there's no opportunity to learn. Like, I don't even get to
Mhm.
come back and
Yeah.
participate and grow and learn.
Yeah.
But this idea of grace in this equity journey is something we do have to extend to ourselves, because
Yeah.
if it's
Yeah.
a journey, you're not going to get it right every day. Some days will be better than others. Mistakes will be made. You have to give yourself grace, because that's what encourages you to keep going on the journey. And you also have to extend grace to those around you, people who are making, may not have it, all the answers. Nobody does. No one has it all
Yeah.
together. But if we can extend grace, receive and extend grace, I think we will go further on this journey together. Because once we cancel people, once we write people off, people are discouraged, and there's no community anymore for them to continue their learning or to be brought back in and encouraged to keep going forward.
Yeah.
Mhm. So at the beginning, Moza, you were talking about how important it is for educators to look inward before they can look outward, and to think about and reflect on, the environment of the classroom and how a student may be behaving in the classroom, how it could be a reflection of what they're experiencing in the classroom.
Mhm.
And it made me think of, in the clinical social work that we do, as therapists, we talk about and think about, especially when it comes to adult-child relationships, so caregiver-child relationships, right? Mirror neurons, which says that, children pick up on energy. They pick up on
Yes.
what's happening in their classroom,
Yeah.
what's happening in the space. And so, if the adults in the classroom who are caring for these children while they're in the classroom with them, if their energy is not one that is mellow, or if they're feeling chaotic, or if they're feeling angry, or if they're feeling, overwhelmed by things that are happening in the school building, in their personal life, right? The children can sense that, and that
Yes.
can, they mirror that, those behaviors and those emotions and that energy. Um, and that can be, those are some of the things that can come out.
Yes. Yeah. And I
I
think about that quote, from Maya Angelou, I think it is, that people never forget how you make them feel. Like
Mm.
in a room where you're teaching, and sometimes teaching to the test, right? To
Mhm.
get them through. But that idea of how this adult, this leader in my life made me feel like I could learn, made me feel like I could do what it is that they're asking me to do, is an
Yes.
unspoken thing, but it's so powerful.
I just so appreciate what you are both saying about the role, like, teachers have this responsibility. And in order for teachers to create a classroom that's healing, because that's a classroom should be a healing, uplifting, joyous, really enriching space where, I feel like I can succeed, I can thrive. And you're
Yeah.
coming back to this point of it's teachers are the ones who are cultivating or nourishing that space. But I also hear you saying, how can teachers give what they don't have?
Yeah.
How can I create a space of joy and liberation and, this idea that I can thrive when the teacher themselves is not feeling joy, is not feeling like
Yeah.
they're thriving. And I think that's something sometimes, those of us who are working, to sort of create policy and, sort of implement policy, like we can't bypass the teachers. We can't say, like, we want to do this for students. Teachers are the conduit of the policies we're trying to apply in the classroom. And
Yeah.
the question is, how are we who say we're committed to honoring children, how can we bypass the teachers who are, they're the conduits, they're the facilitators of so many of the things that, policymakers are trying to implement. And I say that we have a duty of care to teachers. Like, I think for the leaders who are listening, the APs, the teacher team leaders, grade team leaders, I think we need to not forget that teaching has one of the highest burnout rates. And I I think it's, we forget that, like learning, teaching has emotional, social, psychological aspects to it. And
Yeah.
teachers also bring their whole humanity to their
Yeah.
craft. And if we're only saying you're a professional, wait, what about I'm a human being?
Right.
Right.
What about taking care of the whole human being? Like, we can't ignore the humanity of teachers and expect somehow that they will uplift the humanity of students. I think in many ways we perpetuate the things we have experienced ourselves, And while I know many teachers are working through very difficult school, you know, cultures, very difficult, school environments, they're still finding ways to allow students to thrive. I don't think that, that's something that should have to be. I think it should sort of flow out of the beauty and the nourishment and the, just the thriving that the teacher is experiencing. It's an overflow in their classroom too, I just wanted to say that I feel like teaching is one of the few professions where we honor people who literally don't take care of themselves. Like, think about how we
Yeah.
define the incredible teacher, right? The
Right.
incredible teacher is not eating lunch. The incredible teacher is spending their own money to buy books, buy resources. The incredible teacher is, not staying in the building till 7 and coming in the building at 6 a.m. Somehow, the narrative we've created around the teacher who is effective is a teacher who is self-sacrificing. But I think that that's such an unfair ask.
And no, it's problematic and it's not realistic and it's not sustainable.
Right.
Yeah. And then, we wonder why teachers were teacher of the year last year and this year they're ready to walk. We have created a narrative around amazing teachers, as you say, that it's not sustainable. We also have to think about how can we honor teachers taking care of themselves, teachers remembering that they're human beings, like, and still serving students well.
Yeah.
So I think this is a great place to remind our members of who we are and what we do at the Member Assistance Program, right? We're here to support our members with their mental health needs, right? You said earlier, Moza, about the importance of a teacher reflecting inward before they can reflect outward and support their students and create an equitable classroom. And that's what we do at MAP. We're a team of clinicians who help our members do exactly that, reflect inwards through individual consultations, support groups, and other wellness workshops. So, your union is here to support you.
Yes, and We want to take this time to thank Moza Coote for joining us today for our August podcast. We are so glad to have you, Moza.
Well, it's been a pleasure being with you. If it's okay, I just wanted to let you know that our team, the new teacher mentoring team, our work is ensuring that new teachers get the support that they need by having a mentor who will definitely, allow you to support you to think about how new teachers, whether you're thinking about how to create a classroom that's going to be more equitable, or how can you, begin to do the self-work. All those things are one of the reasons we advocate deeply for mentoring. And just thank you to both of you for this opportunity to be here with you.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for the work that you and your team are doing every day to support new educators.
And our students, right? It's such important work that you and your team are bringing to the forefront to, yes, support our educators, but also it has that trickle-down effect of also supporting our students too.
Yes, those 1.1 million students who, I call it an honor to serve. We get to impact these lives, and it's a gift, and I wouldn't trade what I do for the world, so yeah, absolutely an honor.
If someone was interested in teaming up with someone from the new teacher mentoring team, how do they do that?
You can absolutely reach out to M as in Mary, T as in Tom, S as in Selma, MTS support at schools.nyc.gov.
Well, thank you again, Moza, for joining us. And please look out for our next Classroom Café podcast. Once again, thank you for joining us for this episode of the Classroom Café. If you are a UFT member, the Members Assistance Program can be reached at 212-701-9620 or at mapinfo@uft.org.